good morning, everybody. My name is Elmaleh. I am the Senior Manager of Business Development for the Northwest Seaport Alliance. Before we get too much into this, can I see a raise of hands who has ever heard of the Northwest Seaport Alliance? Holy cow, I'm surprised, yeah. Well, so we're the managing entity for the ports of Tacoma and Seattle. We've talked throughout the conference that Port of Tacoma is one of the 17 strategic ports, and Port of Seattle is one of the alternate strategic seaports. So the military is a terrific customer of ours. But again, I just want to thank the sponsors of this conference and those who have endeavored to put this on. This is one of the few conferences that I get to attend where the content is equal to the networking opportunities. So it's really a true testament of the value of this, and I hope to see more of this. So. My bio is short. You can put it legibly on a postage stamp compared to the people next to me. So why don't we just talk a little bit about who we have up here on the panel. So we have Bruce Busler, who's two down there, who needs no introduction, kind of had an intro yesterday, who is the Director of the Joint Distribution Process Analysis Center at the USTRANSCOM. We have Colonel Frederick Crist, who is a commander of the 597th Transportation Brigade out of Fort Eustis, Virginia. Just to my right here, we have Major General Pat Kelly, retired. He's a member of the ILA, and I think we're going to talk a lot as we go through enhancing port readiness. Labor is a major component of that. Christopher Smith, is he up here? Yeah, there we are, thank you. Who's Vice President of Business Development for Ports America. We have Lieutenant Colonel Donald Santillo, who's a commander of the 842nd Transportation Brigade. And then we have Lieutenant Colonel Chad Blacketer, who's a commander of the 841st Transportation Brigade. I really, I thought about reading everybody's bios, but I think that will take more time than the panel has been allotted. So why don't we just jump into it? Then I think as each person kind of goes down the line, they can, we've got about a 5-minute presentation per person. We're not going to do any slides. It's going to be more of an interactive forum. Please feel free to direct any questions to anybody up here. But when I was thinking about the opportunities of enhancing port readiness, this whole conference has quite frankly been about that. And it's leading up to this, what are we talking about? We're talking about the ability to move very quickly in the event of a national emergency. And we're talking about training and testing for those opportunities. I shouldn't call them opportunities. It's a sad thing if it ever happens. Mm-hmm. So, since this is a broad topic, we've talked about the infrastructure, we've talked about practicing and testing port planning order scenarios, talking a little bit about labor. Perhaps Major General Kelly can tell us how many members there are of the ILA. I know in the ILWU, which is a West Coast labor source, we have about 14,000 members and growing. So some of the questions that I was thinking about, and some of the things that we might want to talk about is, since you can't load the ships without labor, not at a commercial port, how can we enhance that? How deep is our bench when it comes to labor? How trained are they on military equipment? What happens if a port planning order is issued and we have 48 hours to clear space and that's 45 acres of backland space plus 3,000 linear feet of berth space. We've all committed to that. So that is a significant lift. And how can we do that so that we are not pinching the pocketbook of the government? It's got to be done in the most cost-effective way. And with respect to labor, so you're going to burn a lot of labor just in that initial 48 hours. I know Tacoma has one of the larger locals on the West Coast. So you clear out space within 48 hours. Then you have a sustained loading operation for the military. Meanwhile, you have your commercial customers that you also need to try to attend to as best you can. How deep does that bench go? And what can we do to enhance that? So do we need more training? Who's going to pay for that training? And I think the last point I'd like to make before I hand it off is communication. I think one of the things that enhancing port readiness is communication. We know that 48 hours is kind of is what we all signed up for, but as much warning as we can get to prepare, the better, and the more we can communicate that. And in talking with our local transportation battalion team, I've asked this in the past, and they said, well, watch CNN. You'll get a good idea if you're going to be called up. So anyway, why don't I hand it off? I know Colonel Crist, you talked about perhaps going next, and then we could kind of go down. We could go down the line, or we can
Go down the line, sir.
Okay. So how about you?
Anything you want to do.
Oh, perfect. Please ask my wife to listen to those comments.
You want me to go?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
I'm going to give the labor perspective for port readiness. As a lot of you are aware, the ILA has had and played an important role in our military successes all the way from World War I through Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. We are presently provide the stevedoring services at 3 ports: the port of Sunny Point, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and the ports of Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Corpus Christi in Texas. Now, I'm going to concentrate on 2 major areas in my presentation. One will be on procurement, and the other one will be on contingency operations, because those were discussed yesterday actually quite prevalently. For stevedoring procurements, that is stevedoring and related terminal services, TRANSCOM and SDDC use a LPTA, that's low price, technical, acceptable procurement approach. 5 years ago in 2014, 2015, TRANSCOM had put out 5 solicitations for the East and the Gulf Coast using an LPTA approach. 2 of those were won by a company called Shippers. They won those procurements for Charleston, South Carolina, and Beaumont, Texas. Within 2 years, Shippers quit and arranged for the contract, both contracts, to be turned over to Cooper Ports America. So why did that happen? I think the inherent problem and the answer lays in the whole concept of low price, technically acceptable. Let me explain. LPTA became the vogue within DOD and in TRANSCOM about 7 or 8 years ago, when you had declining DOD budgets and you had the perception that the government could save money through an LPTA. Now, LPTA is a good technique, a good procurement technique, when you know what the requirements are. If you're going to manufacture widgets and you've manufactured them before, is ideal. In my prior life, if you're going to build a military facility that you have built before, that you have worked out all the issues, then an LPTA is perfect. But stevedoring services, the requirements vary, and more importantly, the time between events vary. To survive under an LPTA, a stevedoring company has to survive. There is no incentive for innovation. There is no incentive to provide the additional training necessary to be successful, as we'll see later in a contingency operation. They must meet their low price. Now let's look at the 4 factors that are involved in any procurement. They're real simple. What is the management? What is the technical approach? What is that company's past performance and experience? And what is the price? Normally there's a trade-off. That's not true in LPTA. The first 3 factors, management, technical approach, and past performance and experience, they're rated either they pass or they fail. And low price then becomes the dominant factor. Shippers passed the management, the technical approach, the past performance, and they indeed had the low price, and they failed miserably. What I'm going to ask you to do, and this is to TRANSCOM and SDDC, because we have a lot of procurement people here, is I seriously think you need to look at best value for the government. Now, best value looks at all 4 factors, not the last factor, low price, not a pass-fail requirement. They look at them all. Do we have the right management with that contractor? What's his approach to getting the job done? And did he do it well before? And oh, by the way, does he have an acceptable low price? Acceptable low price. So what you do is you end up weighing all those factors and you end up, in my mind, with the best procurement. Now I'm bringing this up because I think the timing is very important. I mentioned earlier that in 2014-15, there were 5 solicitations issued for the East and the West Coast for stevedoring. Those procurements are going to expire in 2020. So TRANSCOM right now is getting ready to put some new procurements, new solicitations on the street. And between the 2nd of May and when those come out in September, October, November, I think there's sufficient time for TRANSCOM and SDDC to reevaluate this whole concept of low price versus best value. The next area I'm going to talk about is contingency operations. A lot of discussion yesterday on that, and I'd like to contribute a little. Suppose we would be SDDC, our stevedoring companies, and us, the International Longshoremen Association personnel, are to react to a real-world emergency situation. The precursor of that, General Farman, is your speed of war time frame. Is a good test. All you have to do yesterday is to, Admiral Clark here, remember he had that one slide? And it had 4 sub-slides within that slide? And it showed over a short period of time the work requirement in the upsurge went from here to eternity. That's a very important slide. Can we respond to that? I don't know the answer to that, but I have an issue with whether we collectively have enough trained operators. Who are they? Crane operators, forklift operators, winch operators, the operators who can take an M1 tank, drive it off a roll-on, roll-off ship, bring it through the yard and put it on a rail car, and vice versa. Do we have enough of those? I don't think we do. I think we got I think we are barely adequate number of trained operators to do our routine work right now. Nevertheless, for a real-time emergency. And why is that? I think it goes back to LPTA again. In order to survive, the stevedoring contractor has to do the absolute minimum. And he has the absolute minimum of operators necessary to do the job. That's wrong. That's wrong. So my recommendation, and it's a pretty simple one, you got these new procurements coming up. What you can do to get ready for a contingency operation is put a requirement in there. Whether it's LPTA or best value, hope you're going to go to the latter, but either way, put a requirement in there to have an adequate number of trained operators so that you can handle those speed of war time frames or a real emergency. The other thing I want to bring out also is that there is an asset using ILA personnel in that you heard that I said that we have three, we maintain the services, 3 locations. If, for instance, that the requirement, Admiral Clark's slide, where it goes out of sight, so you don't have enough operators right now, you put in the requirement in your new solicitation, but that still doesn't meet enough. With the ILA, we can bring in people from other locations, crane operators, other people, to help overcome that void. We did it in 1990-91 timeframe at Sunny Point. We brought in all sorts of crews and operators because the upsurge far exceeded anything that we had there. We did it then, and we can do it again. The other last point that I'm going to bring up is we are very excited about SDDC's thrust to bring in new ports for a military strategic port. Yesterday afternoon, I took time off and I visited the Port of Virginia ports, and I was totally impressed. I visited Norfolk News, Portsmouth, and Lambert Ship Dock. They have unbelievable facilities, rail coming in, you fall off the thruway, you make an immediate left turn, and you are right there in that marine terminal. The rail goes in and out in a lot of locations. You got a wharf in Portsmouth that must be a mile long. So I think, General, I got a good initiative of what you're looking at for alternatives, and I think it'll work out nice. Sir, that concludes my presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So, Bruce?
Yeah, thanks. I'm actually going to call up that slide if you've got it up there. Not only am I the director of the Analysis Center for USTRANSCOM, I'm also dual-hatted as the director of the Transportation Engineering Agency, which has been around for 55 years roughly. And what I wanted to do today was a question got asked yesterday by Kevin Tokarski, which is how do we designate strategic seaports? And it was a great question because the real challenge to me is what's the requirement for a strategic seaport as it aligns to our national defense strategy? And then ultimately you ask the question, ready for what? Well, ready for what is the requirement that we've established for seaports to meet the national strategy. So I thought I'd share with you a little bit about our role, both as the Analysis Center for USTRANSCOM, but also my role as the Director of Transportation Engineering Agency to be able to address the demand we have here. So I'm going to just take most of my time to kind of lay out the history of the program and how we've established the current ports today and where we're going to make an assessment going into the future. If you look back over time, in 1966, MARAD had established a manual for federal port controllers and looked at all of the ports that we had to meet national security. And it really goes back to emphasize, again, our strong partnership between DoD and the Department of Transportation in terms of how we look at using civil infrastructure. So my role in TEA is not only to assess ports, we also have national programs for highway and rail. Some of them have been around for almost 100 years. And we look at the confluence of all those to meet the power projection requirements of the nation. In 1975, Major General Del Mar, who was a distinguished commander of now what's SDC, looked at right-sizing our terminals and shed many of the military terminals, but also looked at how we can use commercial seaports to be able to support national requirements. In 1977, the Ports for National Defense program was actually established. In 1982, a study was created that established 23 strategic seaports, ironically the same number of ports we have today. The other thing that's, I think, important to say, what are the governing aspects of how we look at the seaports? So in 1985, the Nprn, which is the current structure that we in federal government use to be able to define and work with all of the civil operators that provide for capacity, was established. And in 1988, the executive order, which many of you are very familiar with, told the Department of Defense that we had to work with the civil ports to ensure that they had the capacity to meet our needs and that we negotiated with them the ability to set aside those specific capabilities that we required for a national emergency, which is the very basis for how then we go out and assess the needs to be able to do the power projection requirement. And so from that, we've done a series of studies over time that many of you will recognize. One of the ones that probably is most, I'll call it current, was started in 2008. Actually, LMI was the organization that provided that for TEA, which was looked at the output requirements. And from that, you talked about yesterday, we added Port Arthur to the program for that requirement there. Fast forward again, and a congressionally mandated requirement that we provided in 2012 was a very thorough assessment of all the ports, as well as the road and rail access to those ports, to be able to meet the national requirements. And from that, we did some further assessments, which then we added Gulfport to the Gulf Coast. And the reason I mention this is that as we do our studies, we look at the total requirement, primarily from the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and West Coast, to be able to meet the national security requirements. And the current strategy, many of you recognize, came out in 2018, but the sealift requirement is really what drives the needs for seaports. And the overall requirement for sealift has been relatively stable for 20 plus years. I mentioned yesterday we've done 7 major mobility studies. In all of those studies, we've had a need for about 10 million square feet of surge sealift. On top of that, adding about another 4.5 million square feet that would be repurposed from our pre-flow vessels as they discharge, and almost 4 million square feet that would come from Visa, or from, depending on the scenario, from contributions from allied operators. So about 19 million square feet total. That then has to workload, and you can see up here the number of times they have to turn the vessels. But that then sets the requirement for how many ports we have to have and their proximity to the power projection platforms to meet the end-to-end force closure. So I guess that's the first big takeaway, is when we select strategic seaports, they have to not only provide the capable capacity at each of the East Gulf or West Coast, or in the case of Alaska, Hawaii, those unique locations. But the reason we picked that port is it's aligned between the power projection platform to maximize force closure to the combat theaters. And that's driven primarily from the major land campaigns. And in 2010, we went from primarily 2 major ground campaigns to 1 with what's called deterrent as second theater. So that major ground campaign is what drives the need for our seaports. And so from that, then, we go out on a recurring basis and do the studies that now set the number of ports and the specific capabilities that we have to have in those seaports. So in 2015, we did that port look study. Many of you may recognize that. Many of the ports provided us their plans to improve their infrastructure over time, and then we assessed the rail and road access. And for the most part, found that they are very capable of supporting our needs, with some spot areas that we identified to the Congress that needed to be addressed. The challenge we have is going to be is that when we talk about the ports in their program, there's a cost to be in the program. We're asking you to set aside capacity. As General Farman talked about yesterday, we're trying to put workload through those ports, ensure that they understand our needs. So within TRANSCOM, as we look at the readiness requirements, we kind of put them in 3 different categories, and think of it kind of as a pyramid. So for the first thing we have to look at is the specific capabilities we require. And I'll remind you again, we talk about a lot of the ports we use in a day are very much based on a commercial activity that moves container cargo. But for the sealift requirement for national security, it's primarily unit equipment on a ro-ro. And so as you look at the specific capabilities, both landside and waterside, you have to then ask, what are those specific underlying things that have to knit together to provide the output? The second one, we look at the capacity. Many of your port planning orders have identified capacity. We typically provide that as square feet per day that you have to produce as output. And that becomes the number that you then have to meet within 48 hours to be able to match up with the ships and the units that are deploying through those locations. But the last one, I'll kind of dovetail on this as well, we look at the organizational ability to conduct those missions, primarily proficiency and availability. And so now it becomes, can you meet the timelines that I show you up here to produce the wartime surge requirement to get those units on those vessels to then meet not only 1, not only 2, but 3 different turns over a period of about 120 plus days to meet the requirement. And so, I'd offer, if you look at readiness, as we look through the PRCs primarily, we have to be able to turn those ports and operate them with high intensity for those brief periods of time. So how do you create a structure to assess your landside output, your waterside capabilities, the security of those during those times of operation? And I would say there's another domain we have to include as well, and that's the cyber domain that should be assessed equally with our land and waterside domains to to understand, is that port ready? And are they capable of meeting our national security requirements? So that's in a nutshell basically how we within the Department of Defense set requirements, and we use that as a basis for assessing readiness to be able to meet our national security requirements. And I'll stop there and simply say that I hope that you have some questions, because we have another port look that will be done in 2020. Typically these are done in conjunction with our mobility studies, and that will be the next opportunity we have. We do about every 4 to 5 years to reassess the composition of the ports and their ability to support the national security requirements. So that will start off later this year. It takes about a year to do that, and then we'll realign both the strategic seaports and the alternate ports that are aligned with those to provide resiliency to be able to ensure we have the means of meeting our national security requirements. And so I'll stop there and to say that that's the foundation for how strategic seaports are identified that are in the programs that every one of you are invested in. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So next we have Colonel Fred Crist, who is the commander of the 597th Transportation Brigade, located here in Fort Eustis.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Colonel Fred Crist. I'm the commander of the 597th Trans Brigade. My brigade is responsible for moving, deploying, and sustaining the armed forces to deliver readiness and lethality at speed. And we do that by mission commanding 3 transportation battalions who are responsible for mission commanding the strategic seaports on the CONUS East Coast and the Gulf Coast and Puerto Rico, and supporting the deployment of all the power projection platforms east of the Rocky Mountains. And so this morning I want to be able to provide an operational and tactical perspective to what we're doing, so that when we talk about the ports being the nexus of intermodal activity, I think our transportation battalions are the nexus of the planning and the coordination between what Mr. Busler is talking about in the higher level perspective of capacity and O-plan deployment, and the nexus of the capacity, the transportation capacity, in order to be able to produce a strategic effect. So I really want to start off with some thank yous, because this has been a phenomenal day and a half. I want to thank the leadership of NDTA, U.S. Transportation Command, SDDC, and especially Christopher Newport University for putting this together, because we really have a great conversation that has been going on over the last 2 days, or last day and a half here. Dr. Bush, I really want to thank you for your leadership in preparing the next generation of civilian leaders to enter the national policy space. I think you're doing a great job in being able to kindle that fire in our young people to enter the national security space. And I hope that our example of this military and civilian interplay kindles some more of that fire, so that they know that all the elements of national power are not about the military only, that the real elements of national power involves and truly demands this synchronization between the military and our civilian and commercial capacity. And I know that one day some of your students are going to be congresswomen and policy writers that I'll probably be calling sir and ma'am on the other side of the table. And lastly, I want to thank the 4th component. So General Broadmeadow yesterday talked about having to think about preparing for America's worst day. So I would say we haven't experienced America's first day, but over the last 2 years of my command, I've experienced some bad days, and I would say that I have not experienced that bad day alone, because right beside me and our battalions has been our 4th component. And I really want to highlight just a couple of places where that happened, so that you can see yourself in that fight. So in 2017, we were deploying the 2nd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division to Europe as a speed of war movement to deter Russian aggression. This was a definite demonstration of national power. And right on top of that deployment, Hurricane Harvey struck the Texas Gulf Coast. And so not only did that cause an interruption to the deployment, but it also caused a lot of disruption into the personal lives of the stevedores, the port executives, as well as the commercial shipping. And so I always remember a picture of Beaumont. There was a vessel who was that was partially loaded, was unable to move prior to the storm's landfall, and it truly required 4 tugboats to keep that ship moored to the pier, because the currents were going to rip her off and push her downstream and just completely blocked the Sabine River. So not only would it have affected that deployment, but it would have affected that piece of national infrastructure. So we weren't alone. Chris Fisher, I'd look at you right in the eye if I could see where you're at right now. And then Chris, your folks there too. We were not alone. And then in 2018, we were deploying the second MEF. The second MEF was deploying to Norway to participate in an exercise called Trident Juncture. So the 2 MEF was deploying on its largest deployment since OIF-1. And they were participating in the largest series of amphibious operations that they've conducted in at least 2 decades. And so the 2 MEF was embarking on the Iwo Jima out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and its cargo was embarking on a commercial vessel at the port of Wilmington. And then Hurricane Florence struck. That hurricane ceased operations, but it wasn't until, really a shout out to John Dittmar and the team at Wilmington, they continued to load that ship until the storm approached. And they were measuring their operations in hours. I mean, we were loading it to the very last minute in order to get that vessel off pier and moving across the way. And what was important, they truly understood the strategic effect we were trying to get, because that deployment of the 2 MEF, like I said, largest 2 MEF deployment since OAF-1, was a massive deterrent effect and demonstration of national power to conduct these large-scale amphibious operations across the North Atlantic before they actually got to Norway. And if you're watching the open source news, that also happened to be the exercise that so created a reaction with our potential adversaries to the east that there was evidence of GPS jamming occurring during that exercise. But that strategic effect that occurred from that deployment all resulted in the 4th component standing by us in the wake of that storm to be able to produce that deployment. And then it didn't end there. There was cargo that was left behind because it didn't all make it, and we had to ship that cargo, commercial trucking, weaving the roads from North Carolina to the Port of Virginia. And the Port of Virginia, just unplanned, but completely understood what we were trying to achieve in a strategic effect, opened the doors to us, and Chad Blacketer can talk about it some more, but allowed us to get that last tranche of equipment out the door and underway in order to be able to produce that effect for the EUCOM commander. So even though we haven't had America's worst day, we certainly have had glimpses of it, and we were not alone when we did that. So thank you very, very much. So today's panel about enhancing port readiness, I think everyone always talks about or thinks about, it's about enhancing readiness means infrastructure development, means an investment of capital. And I would offer that we can get after the enhancing port readiness through shared understanding. Enhancing port readiness through infrastructure is capital intensive, it takes time, and it's expensive, but creating shared understanding is inexpensive, and it can begin right now. And it is beginning right now. When we all walk out of here, I think we'll understand what we're trying to get after. So what does shared understanding mean? It's talking about understanding the new security environment that all of us are going to are living in right now. It's understanding that on each of these deployments, it's about creating a strategic effect. It's not just moving cargo, it's creating a strategic effect for the nation and for a combatant commander forward who's going to receive those forces. And those effects are in terms of deterring an adversary, shaping a forward security environment, or deploying troops into combat to conduct a RIPTOA forward. So really fast, I have 3 key themes to talk about today. One, I want to be able to provide you a different perspective on how the strategic seaports fit into this new security environment. Number 2, I want to talk about how collectively we produce a strategic effect for the nation through what General Broadmeadow talked about yesterday, through strategic maneuver. And lastly, highlight some areas where we can work on things today to continue enhancing port readiness. So first off, the strategic security environment and how you fit into that. We've talked a lot about it. And let me describe to you that the Department of Defense is no longer talking about it. We've codified it in doctrine and joint concepts so that we as a uniformed force are moving forward to be able to operate in that environment. So it's not just mere talk. We've taken the effort to codify it. And so you see it in 2 big documents. Army Field Manual 3-0 Operations. 3.0, and you also see it in the Joint Forces concept of multi-domain operations. So when the DoD actually codifies it and puts it onto paper, we all move towards the sound of the guns in executing that way. So the Army 3.0 operations manual describes a battlefield framework that talks about how do you visualize the future fight? Well, the future fight is not just about a forward fight where it's kinetic activity on another continent. They describe a battlefield framework that describes a fight that occurs overseas. There's a deep fight, there's a close fight, there's a rear fight, and then it extends all the way back to CONUS in what we're now calling the strategic support area. That's a significant shift in where we as a uniformed force sees the fight, because we now see that the CONUS industrial base and the CONUS transportation base in our homeland is inextricably linked to a forward fight. So I think everyone gets it that we have this end-to-end continuum of fort to port, and port to foxhole. And we all see how when we want to look forward into the fight that is happening over there, you can sort of feel that you're in the fight here. But I'd like to describe for you, look at it from an adversary perspective. The adversary who now stands overseas and sees the fight coming to them. The adversary is not going to allow our forces to deploy and marshal and organize and then wait for us to get in front of them to fight us. Every fight is a defense in depth. And so when you look at it from the adversary's perspective, a defense in depth from their homeland across Europe, across the sea lines of communication, the Atlantic, to our seaports, and then through our seaports to our post camps and stations, the Fort Rileys, the Fort Hoods. So we've talked about how, by your association with us, you are part of that fight. I just want to make sure you understand from an adversary perspective, when you go from their homeland across that deployment continuum in reverse, you are inextricably linked to that fight. And so what does that mean? That means that they would prefer not to fight us head on their homeland. They're going to do everything they can to fight in depth and to disrupt in depth. And that's not necessarily kinetic activity in CONUS. It's really those non-lethal capabilities in CONUS along the cyber domain and disruption activities at your seaports and along the CONUS lines of communication all the way back to the home station. So truly ports are squarely in the adversary's attack vector. Number two, I want to talk about how we collectively are producing strategic effects for the nation through strategic maneuver today. It's not a concept that we're going to do some other time. We're doing it today. And so today, when we talk about how are we organizing for the next fight is going to be on a scale that the Army is calling large-scale combat operations. The idea of conducting small-scale counterinsurgency operations has been useful for the last fight, but the fight that we're looking at in the future is that we need to be prepared to conduct a large-scale combat operation on the scope of deploying divisions and corps and Marine Expeditionary Forces at the scale of tens of thousands of soldiers, airmen, and Marines and all of their equipment. What's also different is we are not falling in on theater-provided equipment. We're deploying large combat formations with all of their equipment from their motor pools through your ports, and then we're deploying it in a way that it's configured to be able to fight as soon as possible on the other side. So we're no longer moving cargo, we're truly producing this strategic effect, and every movement is observed. Every deployment is an opportunity for our adversary to measure our capability and capacity to do something at scale and at speed, and we can't do this alone. It's the collective effect that we're going to produce together. So each of our deployments are truly demonstrations of national power, similar to what MSC showed yesterday with the deployment of the Great White Fleet around the globe. Our deployments are very similar to that of the sail of the Great White Fleet. And lastly on this, we don't merely redeploy forces from overseas back to our post camps and stations. We don't even use the term redeployment anymore. We use the term deployment to home station operations. DTHS. And what's important about that is our ability to deploy through these strategic seaports is not only about projecting national power to put into contact and create that strategic effect, it's also being able to rapidly redeploy or deploy to home station through your strategic seaports in order to regenerate very, very quickly combat power at the post-Gamson station. Because those forces that we bring back through on an old redeployment are going home to regenerate, to reset, and to be put back on deck to be able to respond to a crisis. And so I want to make sure that we change our perspective on it's not just projection, it's also through redeployment, and we're going to do that through our strategic seaports. Now lastly, where are places that we can highlight, or what are some places I can highlight that we can work on together? This is one of the great forums here is operationalizing the NPRN, taking it to the next step, and operationalizing at the brigade level and below. We're doing that right now through our conduct of the Port Readiness Committee meetings. We do that when we have a regulatory requirement to do it, but we do that prior to every major deployment and redeployment because that allows us to bring this collective layered approach on local law enforcement, Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, the stevedores, in order to be able to create that effect through the port. The next thing is taking your quarterly port assessments and using them for more than just O-plan reviews. And so right now, quarterly port assessments are used by SCDC G5 to be able to look at whether or not we have the capacity to conduct a deployment relative to an O-plan. And where I see an opportunity is being able to make sure we take those port capacity assessments each quarter and allow that to feed into our almost daily assessment of port capacity in order to be able to paint a picture for the SDDC commander on what does he have in his battle space to be able to deploy. And then lastly, and really talking to Nuns James last night, one of the big things there is we need to share our speed of war lessons learned that we've done at an isolated seaport across this network and across this community so that each of our strategic seaports are gleaning the lessons that we learned the hard way at a particular seaport for a speed of war move so that collectively the entire community is improving and not just one particular place. We talked in depth about stevedore training, and I would say it's depth of that training at a particular port, and then breadth of training across multiple seaports. Because one thing we always worry about is cannibalizing trained labor at one port when we're trying to do simultaneous operations at various ports, and we know that's a possibility, and that goes into our calculus and when we pick ports. We have a couple of great opportunities to practice this, and that's probably the best way to do it, to just practice it right now. Defender 20 next year is going to be our version of a reforger. That is going to be the largest deployment of forces from CONUS to the continent of Europe that we've done since the 80s. And so that's going to give us a great rep. And then the other training opportunity is once a year, Forces Command executes a CDRE, a Sea Emergency Deployment Exercise. And so once a year, a brigade combat team thinks it's going off to the National Training Center in Fort Irwin or to Joint Readiness Training Center. They buy trains, they get ready to truck and rail on a conventional deployment to a training center. All of a sudden, about 3 weeks in advance, FORSCOM gives them an alert order that they're going to conduct a sea emergency deployment exercise. No notice through one of your ports, and then to one of your ports in CONUS. And that definitely gives the entire enterprise an opportunity to quickly come together and produce a strategic effect within a training environment. And then the other place to focus on is our use of cross-country deployments. And I know some ports have seen it where we're no longer just moving a heavy brigade combat team to its closest port of embarkation. We're stress testing not only the port, but the interior lines of communication to move a heavy brigade from the Midwest to the East Coast in order to stress test every element of deployment capacity. So in closing, I acknowledge that there is a financial impact to achieving this level of readiness that the nation needs. So what's important is that we have to have this great conversation in order to be able to share our priorities and our priority movements with the fourth component so that we can mass combat power, military and commercial, at the right place and time, because you can't do that for every move. But for the big ones where we're trying to create a national deterrent effect, we all need to labor as one. So that requires planning and establishing of priorities. It requires advanced communication, just like Andre is talking about. And most importantly, it requires shared understanding to be able to create that effect. And the last point is, everything we're talking about, when we talk about when this occurs, it's not about wanting to go to war. Because when we do this right as a collective team, we will deter war. And that's really what it's about. When we do this at scale in peacetime to prepare for war, we will create an effect that will prevent us from ever having to go to war. And that's really the goal. We don't ever want to say we did this, we went to war, and we told you so. We know that success is in deterring war. So thank you. Thanks, Andre.
Thank you, Fred. The next is Chris Smith, who is the Vice President of Business Development for Ports America.
I want to thank everybody for having the opportunity to be included in this. I mean, and having our voice heard with all overall process of moving cargo. And we look at it as we're kind of the black box that y'all don't get a visual into and how we actually operate and how we do it. So we really do appreciate being up here and having a voice and let people hear what our concerns are to be moved forward. I also want to thank General Kelly. I mean, he basically stole everything I wanted to say. But he actually went down a couple little avenues that I probably would not have gone down being a commercial organization. But I want to give a little flavor on some of the things that happened in the past, and I'll get through that in my presentation, put some color on some things. First off, Ports America is the largest terminal operator in stevedore in the United States. We have 80 terminals in 42 ports. So we basically cover everywhere that you need to move cargo. So we have experience. We've had more SNRTS contracts than any other company in the United States. We've done them in the Pacific Northwest. We currently have MOCCO. Which covers MOCCO, Hueneme, San Diego. We did the Oakland thing. Through our joint venture partner with Cooper, we have Texas and the South Atlantic. So we have a broad breadth of experience in what it takes to actually move the cargo around the United States and load the ships and do it. We had past contracts we also had with Sunny Point. And give you an answer, we also, through our joint venture partner, we did the exercise that was moved through Philadelphia last summer. So when you think about our breadth and our experience and everything that we can do in order to provide it, when the exercise moved through Philadelphia, that team, the stevedoring side, didn't have the experience with regards to moving military cargo. So one of the things that we did, we took all of the company superintendents who'd be working it and actually sent them to Savannah when they were loading a ship to actually learn what it takes and what it does. So there is some connectivity when you look at the breadth of a large company, and even looking at the joint venture partners that we have, either with Cooper or with SSA and DRS. There is benefit to have multiple contracts so we can leverage our scale and cross-train people, which we found is really important. The other thing makes us successful is our partnership with labor. You heard from General Kelly. He is aligned, and the ILA is aligned with us and what we need to do in order to pull off a mission. They are a really good partner to move forward. The ILWU they are a little bit more what you call it, rigid than the ILA. ILA is very flexible, but they are absolutely committed to working with the stevedores when it comes to working missions. So you look at the opportunity when we worked the mission in Oakland this past year. That's something they've never done before. We brought our entire team from Hueneme up there to help run that, to make sure it ran smoothly, and the ILWU stepped up and helped as well. Prior to coming here, I called all of our past frontline stevedores, so the ones who ran Sunny Point and the ones who did Charleston, I've talked to CPA, I talked to our West Coast guys, to really get an understanding of what they see as the need for being ready. And absolutely every single one of them, the first thing they said is training. Said the longshore needs to be trained, and it's not running a mission through a terminal, because that only trains a very small portion of it, of the workforce that is there. It is an ongoing and adequate training program that actually thinks about the replacement of those people who are working. Because you go to a big terminal area, I'll pick Savannah, for instance. If you're going to run a mission through Savannah, there are thousands of longshoremen in Savannah. If you run something through Ocean Terminal, you're training 50 people. If something happens, those 50 people that you've trained might be on the container ship, and you're not going to get them to work for it. So you have to continually train larger groups of people so that they are ready and that we can draw from them. We've talked, if something happens on the West Coast with our team, we would not put all the trained people on the first shift. We would spread them out so they can actually train the trainers. So we've thought through different ways that we can actually spread the knowledge, but that would, based on the pool of who's trained today in all these ports, that would get eaten up relatively quick. There hasn't been a defined training program in over 10 years on the stevedore side. So thinking about it, a defined training program and a way to pay for it. I mean, the ILA and the ILW isn't going to go to do training for free. We will have to pay those men and women to actually go through it and be committed to the operation. The second part that was repeated from the guys is having an effective contract. I mean, General Kelly hit it right on the head. The low price one kills us. I mean, go a little further into the shippers conversation. Shippers called Ports America and Cooper in the summer of 2014 or 2015 and said, hey, we're going to go bankrupt. Will you guys buy us? We looked at it individually as Ports America and Cooper. We didn't want to take the risk because it was too large. We joined forces. It was the right thing to do. We have a great working relationship with them. But I can tell you the day that we closed on that transaction, Shipper had fully drawn their revolver for debt. They had $62 in their checking account for a big company, and they could not draw any more money. We paid off all their debt, took over their military contract. The Charleston and Texas contract did that to them. They were not able to make any money. It bled them to death. If it wasn't for the size and the commitment of Ports America and Cooper, it would have happened again with CPA. But we are committed as a company to stand behind and support everything that's going forward. But it's really to understand that the low price, technically acceptable, is not the right way to look at it. You just have the prices that are challenging. And it also does not encourage us to reinvest in the specific material handling equipment that is needed to move the cargo. There isn't a redundancy of specialized, I mean, I always like to say the turbots that can pull heavyweight things up a ramp. There's only a handful of them. They're $500,000 a piece. We don't make enough on these low price contracts to actually recapitalize them. Now, for instance, if there was a major incident where we were going to war, we would pull from our commercial operations in order to support it, but now we have to figure out how do we actually deal with our commercial customers in going forward. But obviously the government and war would come first. But that's something to really think about. You go back and look at the way contracts were written in the past. Our Beaumont contract that we had before this current one allotted for a stipend to have the equipment sitting there ready and able to work on any given notice to be able to do. Today, everything is included in a commodity rate with no flexibility whatsoever. So if there's no cargo moving, I have to have equipment sitting there, and as a privately run for-profit company, I have very expensive equipment that's idle, and it's very hard to stomach, and it makes us start questioning, why are we in this space? So when you think about exactly what General Kelly said, best value, thinking about the right way to structure the contracts that incentivizes the stevedore to continually invest and be ready is key. But we are absolutely committed as a company with our other joint venture partnerships to support the operations, to train our people. We just need a right mechanism to do it. So, that's all.
Thank you, Chris. Next, we have Lieutenant Colonel Chad Blacketer, who is or apparently we might not. Hold on.
So there's a reason why we don't plan these panels over cocktails. And Chad and Don, you've done great. But I'd like to see if we have one question. If not, I've got a few comments. But raise your hand if you've got, okay, got one back here.
Chris and Major General Kelly, thank you so much for joining us again. And you brought up the same kind of issues that you brought up at the last ports workshop in 2017 fall. On the labor issue, we heard from a couple of ports day before yesterday that the NPRN should be helping arrive at some kind of a national approach to facilitate movement of labor from one port to another, either on the West Coast or on the East Coast, especially in light of the approach that was outlined by Lieutenant General Broadman yesterday, that we want to confuse our adversaries. And the second issue I'd like Chris to mention is MHE still an issue that you mentioned at the last workshop? Thank you.
What was that?
Material handling equipment, you raised that concern at the last workshop. Is that still an issue?
I mean, we have adequate, and I think all the stevedores in the contracts where they are today, there's adequate material handling equipment at the facilities that actually work that cargo today. We have the ability to move, or I'm talking collectively within the industry, to move material handling equipment into specific ports. But I would question is, do we have enough as an industry to handle it in terms of if we were to go to war? That is, I think, a concern. I mean, we would take our commercial cargo and move it, or commercial material handling equipment and move it. But if you go to a port that doesn't handle RoRo and you run RoRo equipment through it, that port has container handling. Pick a port that only does container handling. I'll go to Long Beach. Long Beach is a container port. They don't have low mass forklifts. They don't have tug machines. They have top picks and UTRs. So they don't have the drivers that are associated to know how to operate those pieces of equipment. So it doesn't make sense to run something through a container port. And that's the exact same message I gave last time. But it's a concern of ours if we ever needed that fully exercised.
So if I was the deputy commander at Transcom, I'd probably ask Mr. Busler about that big spike, and then consider General Kelly's comments that they didn't think that we'd be able to handle that big spike. And then I'd say, Bruce, assure me we can handle that big spike. And I'm sure Bruce would assure me that we could. What do you think, Bruce?
So there are a lot of assumptions that go into that, right?
A lot of what?
A lot of assumptions.
Yeah.
You know, the challenge we have, of course, is that, you know, typically when we talk about the ability to surge, we're at 5 to 8 times our normal peacetime volumes when we go to war. I mean, matter of fact, in the sea lift area, it's probably 10 times the volumes we do with every day. So we assume, again, that one of the things that both gentlemen on either side of me talked about is that we look at a regional approach. I mean, the challenge we're going to have is we're going to have people, call it come to the sound of the guns and man up the ports to be able to meet the immediacy of the need. And so I think that's I think a very valid point in terms of do we have the ability to pull, the assumption is that the stevedoring contracts that are in place or that would be put in place can pull from and bring the right labor to play. Our primary focus is on looking at the infrastructure at each of the ports to ensure that they can meet the maximum throughput for all of the primary Army and Marine Corps equipment we'd be pushing through those ports. The assumption, of course, is going to be that all of the associated services will be able to actually conduct those missions. And so that's where I think these are valid points. And so when I mentioned assessing readiness, the ability to assess both landside and waterside, the capability, capacity, proficiency, and availability are the basic building blocks that we look at to go, can we generate all of that output in those terms? So specific capabilities, if you have to have MHE for a specific mission, then you better make sure it's available on the time you have to have it.
I think General Kelly wants to respond to that.
Yeah, just one more comment back to the whether we can meet an emergency situation or not. Again, I would ask, we have a number of battalion and brigade commanders here. And you guys, your success or failure is going to be how you do on that speed of time and or an emergency situation. If I were you, I'd sit down when I get back and I would get with your staff and say, okay, here's Admiral Clark's graph. Do we have enough trained operators and equipment to pull that off? That's my one comment.
That's good advice. So, I know you're dying to say something, but you can't.
No?
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, sir, I agree wholly with you. So, just in our day-to-day operations, on the Gulf Coast, we are the busiest battalion in STDC, and I would say right now we have adequate labor. I'd say we are at a T, but if we go to contingency operations, we would quickly drop because we would not be able to meet that surge. When we do a speed of war move, we're already, as you said, sir, just regionally, we're moving labor from, if we're operating at 3 ports simultaneously, which we do routinely, we're doing that regionally, but we are nowhere, even with our high op tempo, we are nowhere near the scale. So I do have a lot of concerns that it would, not only would we not have sufficient labor to execute, but we'd have a lot of safety and accidents, safety issues and concerns and accidents. Because I have concerns about that during speed of war moves, just in our steady state.
So let me just real quick wrap it up by saying that at TRANSCOM, there are strategic contracts. And I don't know that we viewed this contract as strategic, but my takeaway from this discussion is it should be viewed as a strategic contract that the commander himself is reviewing on a regular basis. And I don't even have to ask General Broadmeadow or General Farmer. I know they've already switched in that direction. So thank you very much, panel, and you really brought out some fantastic points here. Thank you.
Thank you.